Hey, you clicked on my video. Appreciate it. Now be sure to like the video and subscribe to the page. Long enough to cover the subject and short enough to keep it interesting. Welcome to Outta My League. I'm Nick Diaz. We will continue to break down position groups leading up to LSU's fall camp in August. And the positions that LSU fans continue to worry about the most, besides, quarterback, is corner and offensive line. But fans tend to leave out one position that could have just as many questions and concerns, and that's linebacker. So I think we just sort of all assume, because guys like Micah Baskerville, who was LSU's leading tackler in 2020, and Mike Jones Jr., who was a highly rated transfer from Clemson, started to emerge in the second half of last season after Durante Jones was finally able to run his defense once Ed Orgeron would let him. All of those two things, with those two guys, that's not a big question mark. The rest of the position group is a big question mark. Now, I don't know, or I don't think, the linebacker core is going to have the depth or talent concerns as much as, say, corner. But depth and talent concerns are still there. So the projected starters right now coming out of spring are Mike Jones Jr., Greg Penn, and then Micah Baskerville. Baskerville and Mike Jones are the most productive returning starters you've had the last 2 years. But Greg Penn, he was the guy who everyone talked about the most in spring. He had the best spring game out of all the linebackers if you asked all the reporters and coaches. But he's also going to be that swing player for LSU in the linebacking core. Kind of like how Mekhi Garner, the transfer from ULL at corner, he's going to have that swing position where you need that third guy. If you want to have your starting linebackers to have a good rotation, you need at least three. So Greg Penn was a very highly recruited guy, but he hasn't popped yet. They're just sort of waiting for him to finally catch on. Now, that's mostly because he's been poorly coached and had, a dysfunctional head coach the last 2 years. But it looks like this year is the year he may finally be a starter that LSU recruited him to be coming out of high school. Sometimes that just happens with high school recruits. They get a bad coach, or they're not up to speed with learning defense, being around college campus, being away from home for the first time. There's a multitude of factors as to why someone waits to pop until their third or fourth year. Look, when it comes to linebackers, just like every other position on LSU's roster this year, I feel really good about the starters. I feel really good about the starting 22 at every position. It's just depth. Now, the returnees from last year that didn't contribute all that much were Antoine Sampa, Philip Webb, and the walk-on Jared Small, who's like a 6-year senior. There was talk of Jared Small starting last year before he tore his ACL before the UCLA game. Look, I never really felt good about those talks, but I don't think he's going to be a factor to get much major playing time this year, right? I'm not crapping on the guy, but you don't want former walk-ons in their 5th year to be a guy who's a projected starter. And unfortunately for him, I feel bad for him, but he sort of lost his opportunity last year before getting hurt. Antoine Sampa was another high-rated 4-star guy like Greg Penn, who also just hasn't found his footing yet. I don't know if he will this year, seeing as all you heard about during spring was Greg Penn. But Philip Webb, kind of the same thing. Not as highly recruited, but look, Debo Jones and Duke Riley, they were two linebackers that didn't pop until their senior year, and then they got even better once they hit the NFL. So there's options, but hopefully with the addition of Matt House, who's a great linebackers coach and your defensive coordinator, maybe you'll finally see all the talent that those 3 or 4 guys have that haven't quite lived up to expectations, finally squeeze all the juice and potential out of them. Now, the transfers that you had come in, Colby Fields, who was from Rummel in New Orleans, he transferred from South Carolina after his freshman year, and then West Weeks from Georgia, but transferred in from Virginia as a true freshman. Really, I'm going to be honest, those two guys are simply camp bodies to help out during practice, and they will be special contributors on special teams. I think they can be good special teams guys, but I don't expect either of them to be pushing for any significant playing time on LSU's roster at starting linebacker coming this year. Outside of those things, camp bodies and special teams. But I do think West Weeks has the most potential out of both of them to pop later in his career at LSU if he decides to stay. And last, but certainly not least, the guys that are everyone's favorite, the true freshmen. So much hope and so much promise because it's unknown. Harold Perkins and Demario Tolan. So I keep on getting asked over and over again, how are they going to use Harold Perkins this year? How are they going to utilize him? Well, even though Harold Perkins is coming in late as a true freshman, he was the top-rated defensive player by many recruiting sites, at least the top-rated linebacker. So my answer is, how are they going to use him? It's pretty simple. When you watch his film and his skill set, Marcel Brooks in 2019. Marcel Brooks, 2019, obviously he wasn't as highly recruited, but he was a very special young hybrid box safety outside linebacker who would come off the edge in passing situations and had certain pass rush packages under Dave Aranda's defense. And if you look at Matt House's defense, it's very similar philosophy to Dave Aranda's. 3-man front, creative blitz packages, versatile players, versatile looks to confuse the offense. I'm not saying it's, apples to apples, but both Dave Aranda and Matt House are very much cut from the same cloth. Matter of fact, they have similar nicknames. Aranda was called the Mad Scientist, and Matt House has now gained the nickname the Professor by all the new coaching staff and players. So with a talented but young guy like Harold Perkins coming in late, it's very easy to see how you use him and see how athletic he is. Just teach Harold Perkins 1 or 2 or 3 packages or plays, put him on the field, and just tell him, go make a play. Keep it simple. Let him be instinctive. Let him be the freak athlete that he is, and just teach him those 2 or 3 things. And then maybe by the end of the season, he'll be doing more than that. Demario Tolan is someone that I think is the most underrated signee of the LSU freshman signing class. I think he's underrated for several reasons. One, because we're talking so much about Walker Howard and Will Campbell and Harold Perkins and Quincy Wiggins, who were much higher rated guys, and rightfully so. But just watching Demario Tolan's film, he's underrated. Very instinctual, very smart, and very physically gifted. But 2, before he got hurt at the beginning of spring practice, he was practicing, I think, for the first couple of days in spring practice, or first week. The word from reporters and people watching practice was Demario Tolan, he physically was maybe the most impressive-looking linebacker out there, out of all the current linebackers that were out there. Now, Harold Perkins wasn't there yet, but still, that says something. And then the second thing you often heard about Demario Tolan was, quote, he's a lot better than they thought he was. I mean, he's a 4-star guy, top 200 player. I mean, you've seen plenty of 3-star guys come out of nowhere, so why can't he? So this linebacking core, when it comes down to all of it, they have, I think, more talent, more potential, and more stability than, say, the cornerback position. But it really comes down to the 3 things that are probably very similar to the cornerback position if they want to be successful. And that's 1, is Greg Penn for real? Is what we're hearing about in spring, what we saw in the spring game for real? The second thing is, can Mike Jones Jr. continue to prove he can play at middle linebacker like he did at the second half of last year? And then the third thing, how long will it take for the 2 freshmen, Demario Tolan or Harold Perkins, to contribute on a weekly basis? But the biggest help the linebacker room will have this year, just like it will help the cornerback room, the defensive line and pass rush for LSU. So much of that. If I could really choose one position on defense where you would have a bunch of scrubs everywhere except for one position, it would be the defensive line. I would rather have an elite defensive line and so-so linebackers, safeties, and corners, because having a defensive front takes a lot of pressure off of every other position. It starts and ends on the line of scrimmage. And the biggest help it provides are to the linebackers. Thanks for listening to Out of My League. If you like what you heard, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Or follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok in the description link below.